Hello, everyone. And I would like to give a big welcome if you have joined me in talking about recovery community organizations and peer recovery support services. My name is Ginny LaRue, and I identify as a woman in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. I want to tell you, I always like to share about what recovery has done for me, and I share pictures of my family because what recovery has done for me is really bring me back to the place that I should have been all along. So it allows me, recovery allows me to be a grandmother to my beautiful granddaughter, a mother to my middle son with his wife and my granddaughter. And they are expecting a child in March of 2023. And to be a mother to my adult daughter, she's quite the artist. And my eldest son, who is a 5K guy, he likes to run. And to be a stepmother to my two stepsons, Josh and Joey. And adult parent or an adult child, to my father. That's me in the bottom left-hand corner with my mom and dad when I was a baby. My dad has dementia and is in an assisted living facility. And so I am today the person chosen to help him. And that was not always the case for me. And then, of course, the thing I love the most, besides my handsome husband, who just got back from a motorcycle run, is my dog Buddy. And I bring him into the mix because I really like to show that I'm a good pet owner today. In my active use, I was not a good pet owner. I did not make responsible decisions when I got a pet. I usually had to return them or give them away. I was never able to keep a pet for any long periods of time because my substance use got in the way and the lifestyle that goes with substance use. So as we talk about substance use among adults, there are a couple of different in the triangle here that I'm displaying. There's little to no use. So that's usually where, you might have a few drinks with friends after a Friday, happy hour. Maybe you have a couple beers watching a football game. Not to drink and drive. You call an Uber. You don't worry about showing up to work because that's not even an issue. You show up to work. It really doesn't affect your day-to-day life other than occasionally you have some type of a drink, maybe you smoke a joint, something like that. That's little to no use. Harmful use is where our use begins to get in the way of our living. For example, you might get your first DUI, or you've used so much that you can't get up for work the next day and you're having to ask a spouse or a partner to call in sick for you. That becomes harmful use. And usually the harm generally is only done to ourselves. Sometimes it affects our families. People start noticing that maybe we might sort of kind of have a problem with the substance. Addiction is where our lives in our use become completely unmanageable, where we may be in and out of jail. We may be losing jobs repetitively. We may not be able to even find a job. We might get a DUI, our driver's license suspended. Those are the kinds of things that happen in active addiction, active use addiction. There are 23 million people who identify as being in some sort of substance use with an addiction to a substance. And out of that, there are only 2,300,000 treatment beds. So what do we do with the difference? How do we support those folks who are looking to make the transition from substance use or addiction into a recovery process? So as we continue to look at that triangle, we look at the bottom part of the triangle, of course, being prevention. And that would be where we, of course, talk about, not drinking and driving, making sure you have a designated driver, talking about smoking being a substance, maybe talk about other drugs as being harmful to ourselves. Talk about bullying. There are a lot of things that prevention covers, but the bottom part of that, the little to no use that we talked about in the previous slide, is prevention. Early intervention is, oh my goodness, there's beginning to be a problem. We need to intervene. I am your friend. I am your loved one. I say, hey, you might have a problem. Or you say to me, hey, Jen, you might have a problem. Treatment, of course, is where things are really unmanageable. So if we look at where the money goes for those things, we spend $80 billion a year on harmful use, $40 billion for serious use. So if we look at national statistics, as of 2021, according to the CDC, overdose figures, annually, there were 107,622 people died from a drug overdose, some type of substance they overdosed, more than likely an opioid. And that does not account for secondary, like a car accident or a heart attack or peritonitis or other things that are associated with substance use. That's not figured into this number. So that number is probably really higher, but they don't count for if the primary was a car accident, they take it as a car accident as opposed to an overdose. So that annual figure, if you think monthly, it equates to 8,969 people died of a drug overdose in a month. Weekly, that's 2,070 people. Daily, that's 295 people. And hourly, that's 12 deaths per hour. That means while we're doing this video, which is going to be under an hour, 12 people will have died as a result of a drug overdose. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of that brings it home for me. That makes it real, that potentially someone I love or care about could be dying right in this moment. And if you think about the 295 people, if you look at the picture of this Boeing 747, you'll see that basically that seats 200 people. So it would be a little more than filling up this airplane that die on a daily basis. All right, so what is our solution? The solution is recovery. The road to recovery is waiting. So let's talk about the likelihood of sustaining recovery over a period of time. So only a third of people with 1 to 12 months of recovery will sustain it another year without supports. 1 to 3 years, 2/3 will make it another year. 4 to 7 years, 86 will make it another year. And after 7 years, about 14% relapse or have a reoccurrence each year. Now, when we look at what recovery looks like on average, the first year, 1 to 12 months, personally, I started getting more friends that were in recovery. They were clean, they were sober, they were engaged in some type of recovery process. My illegal activity and incarceration stopped. I was no longer writing bad checks. I was no longer buying illegal drugs. I was no longer getting arrested. I was no longer homeless because prior to coming into recovery, I was homeless, living in a van with 3 children. So my homelessness stopped. I wasn't living in a van. Although I was living on someone's couch and my parents had my children, I wasn't homeless or without shelter in the conventional sense of living in the woods or in a van. I was no longer experiencing violence or victimization in my home. There was violence and victimization in my home with my second husband. And so that was no longer happening because I separated myself from that. No one was using in my home or at work or in my social peer network. 1 to 3 years, all illegal activity was no longer happening. I had taken care of any my suspended license. I had taken care of bad checks. I had taken care of my driver's license matched my tag on my car. Things started to be completely legal in all areas of my life. My housing situation changed, albeit I was in a 600 square foot apartment with 3 children by myself. It was mine. I paid for it. And I was no longer living in a van. My employment increased. I went from working in a donut shop to working at the community college that I was going to school at. I started an educational process. I was a later in life student. Things started changing for me. I got a car, those kinds of things. And of course, my employment and income began to get better. Now, I was still a college student, so I wasn't making a ton of money, but things were better. I was no longer reliant on the Medicaid system. I was beginning to pay my own way in the community. 4 to 7 years, my social and spiritual support changed. I started to really connect with my social group and my mutual support group. And along with that, a spiritual path was developed. My mental health was better. I had to start addressing the trauma that I experienced early on in my life. And that started to be taken care of. And I had to bring my children into the process of addressing some of their trauma based on my actions. My housing and living situation continued to improve. I finished my associate's degree. I went on to get a bachelor's degree. I got a job at the University of Central Florida. My income level changed. I got a house. Things were starting to improve. My employment and my income raised, and I was no longer living below poverty level, which I was early on. So let's talk about the definition of recovery. Now, there are a lot of definitions, and you can Google them and find all different types of definitions. Find the definition that works for you and own it. I love this one. This is from SAMHSA, and they define recovery as the process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness. That means that my life started to change. I started to run. I addressed my Hep C. I got my teeth taken care of. I was eating better. I was taking care of myself. I was sleeping. All those things started to happen, and they still do today. And it's also self-directed. That means that I get to say who's in the boat with me in my recovery process. Now, that could mean that I invite a clinician into my recovery process or not. Or it could mean that I don't know, let's see, I am on an MAT, and that's okay too. It may mean that I go to a church. It may mean that I go to a 12-step fellowship. It may mean that I do yoga. It could mean all kinds of things, but the bottom line is I get to direct the path that my life takes in my recovery process. Unless a judge is involved, I get to make those choices. And then, of course, strive to reach full potential. And of course, I don't like to think that I'm at my full potential yet. Where does recovery happen? Well, recovery happens in communities and neighborhoods. So they happen right around the corner, right at the local church, right at the 12-step fellowship, right at a yoga studio. They're naturally accessible support systems and help support people to live a life of independence. So I live in a certain part of the state in Daytona. I can't access recovery services in the panhandle of Florida, let's say. Those are not easily accessible services. So The recovery guiding principles. Again, this is from SAMHSA. It emerges from hope. That means that as I begin to enter my recovery process, I need to have some level of hope that life is going to be better. And that happened for me. The way that happened was that I began to see the evidence that my life was getting better. I started to see health in myself. I started to see that by doing the right thing and taking care of my legal problems and not stealing anymore and not doing drugs, that things changed, and that gave me hope. When I started addressing some of the trauma that was in my life, I started to feel better. That gave me hope. When I was no longer being victimized and staying in a victimized home, my life got better. Another guiding principle is multiple pathways. Again, I get to choose how I recover, whether it's in a 12-step fellowship, whether it's in Celebrate Recovery, whether I choose to, some people choose the path of clinical recovery, where they go see a clinician once, twice a month, 3 times a month, every week. And that is their recovery path, and that works for them. Everybody's different. Recovery guiding principle supported by peers. That means that I do better when I'm with people with lived experience. Clinicians are great, and I need them, and they have helped me tremendously navigate my recovery. But at the end of the day, I need to know that you're saying me too. And when you say me too, I don't feel so alone. And that goes back to, that gives me hope. Recovery needs to be culturally based and influenced. That means that we need to be invitational and inclusive, red, yellow, black, white. Everyone needs to have a voice at the table. And if we don't have diversity and culturally based influence at the table, we need to go make sure that we're inviting them to the table. We need to involve individuals, family, and the community. It takes a village to raise. And so we need to make sure that we are inviting families. I always say that families are in recovery too. My family recovered from me, and they did that in the way that they did that, but they recovered from my disease. And I had a chance to experience that because I have two children of my own and 2 stepchildren. And my 2 boys and one of my stepsons have all 3 experienced substance use. 2 of them have overdosed, survived. And so I know what it feels like to be a family member and suffer from others' actions. So I always say families are in recovery too. We need to be invitational with those families. And of course, we need the community. We need the community to support recovery through advocacy, through law change, through just supporting the people who are living in their community. Recovery needs to be person-driven, holistic. It needs to be supported through relationships and social networks. It is very important that we address trauma. I think I've spoken about that a couple of times. We didn't get here because we ate too much ice cream, I always say. We get here because something happened to us. Significant is all relative. The significance of that is all relative. But the fact of the matter is, there is trauma, and we have to address trauma. And of course, it needs to be based on respect. I need to respect your pathway, and I would hope that you would respect mine in return. So we believe that recovery is real, from not only mental health, but also substance use disorder. People are inspired by stories. I always am transparent about who I am and how I got to where I am. Not because I want a pat on the back from you, but because I think it's very important that we tell our stories out loud, and that we let people know that this is the face of recovery. This is what recovery looks like. We want to shout out loud. Now, I do not talk about what path of recovery I go to, but I do talk about that I am in recovery, and I get to do that. People support what they help create. So if we're creating a trauma-informed, recovery-based community, we're going to support it in our own community. It's easy for me to talk about this, but I support this in my own community in which I live. People want to be heard, not fixed. I saw something not too long ago that talked about how everybody was always trying to fix me. And I was in counseling at 3 years old. I experienced trauma early on in my life. And everybody was always trying to fix Ginny. Everybody was saying, well, if Ginny would just do this, or if Ginny would go talk to this person, or if this happened, or if that happened. I wanted to be heard. I wanted somebody to hear me. And that's why peers were so effective for me. There is no expert in recovery. We have our own lived experience, and I am the expert of my lived experience. We want sustainable change in our communities, in our state, and in our nation. We want to make sure that we're inclusive, invitational, and working with our strengths. And we want to make sure, again, that we include many pathways. So I was asked today to talk not only about recovery, but about recovery, define what a recovery community organization is. So a recovery community organization, or an RCO, is an independent nonprofit organization. They are governed by representatives of the local recovery community. So 51% of folks on the board identify as being in recovery with lived experience from a substance use disorder or other co-occurring mental health. Families are in recovery too. And then you want the rest of your board to be doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. You want to make sure that you get professionals that bring something to the table to support the organization. They do not provide clinical services. Now, RCOs are not designed to be clinical in nature. Now, they collaborate and partner with clinical organizations. They might have a clinician come in and do a particular service. For example, they might come in and do a Hep C or HIV testing. They might come in and do back adjustments like a chiropractor. They might come in and do COVID testing. So those types of clinicians are important, but clinical in nature, they are not. They offer a variety of peer-based recovery support services and programs. For example, community education and advocacy training. We talk about that by saying, if we want to change the laws about criminal background checks, if we want to change the laws about making it a trauma-informed, inclusive community and supportive of recovery, we have to educate our community that recovery is possible. Most people think of recovery or as substance use as the person under the bridge, the person living in the woods, the person without shelter or doing illegal activity. But people do recover. And so the education and advocacy training part is Narcan training. It's teaching them that recovery is possible. And this is what the face of recovery looks like. Outreach programs. So for example, you could have an outreach program where you did a ride along with the police department or with the EMT. You might do a program where you send peers into the emergency room to help support those that have just overdosed. You might have a weekly Narcan distribution in an area with high drug use. Let's say you might have an art therapy class that come in and you have somebody who's good with art and have people come in and learn about art and express themselves. There are all kinds of ways that you can have outreach programs and recovery support services. So there are several types of RCOs. There is, of course, a statewide RCO. Florida has one. It is called Floridians for Recovery. There's one in Georgia, the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse, and there are a few others. Public awareness and peer services and recovery housing. A lot of times, recovery housing and peer services and RCOs kind of tie in a lot together. So you will see some models where there's recovery housing and an RCO together. or maybe the building is over here and the housing is over here, but the services are utilized and they're kind of under the same umbrella. Sometimes you have peer services and training programs. I talked about Narcan training, or peer services and technical assistance. There are just all kinds of models that can be used for an RCO. So if we look at the definition of recovery support services, we can talk about it is designed and delivered by people who both experienced substance use disorder and recovery. So when I talked about earlier the importance of having support from those out who have lived experience, that's what I'm talking about. Peers become peer recovery support, help people become and stay engaged in the recovery process. So for example, if someone was getting out of jail, you might be a peer, an RCO might help go to the jail and develop a relationship with someone getting out of jail, so that when they got out of jail, instead of being picked up by the same type of person that they always did, they do something different and they have someone from an RCO come pick them up and take them to the recovery house. So we want to keep people engaged in recovery, or maybe it's the same thing coming out of a treatment center. We want to embody a powerful message of hope and experiential knowledge. We want to, a peer wants to extend the reach of treatment beyond the clinical setting. So the clinical setting for detox and or treatment are important. They are just the beginning of the recovery process. You walk out the door, you're not recovered. There is a lot more to do in the recovery process. So if we look at peer recovery support services, we can look at some of the things that accompany that. So they precede formal treatment. They can accompany treatment. You can have a peer in treatment. They can follow treatment to assist in relapse prevention. So they follow up after treatment. They are apart from treatment. They accompany outpatient treatment, or they precede formal treatment. And those are just a few examples. Clinical and peer support. Here's the overlap. So if we talk about clinical, we're talking about there's a power differential. It's in a clinical setting. It's shorter term. You're there for a period of time and then you move on. There's a diagnosis attached with it. There's medication involved oftentimes, and there are certain boundaries that are different than the boundaries of a peer. So when we look at peer support, we're talking about there's a role differential. In other words, we have to accept that there are certain boundaries we have to set, but they're not a power differential. It's in a non-clinical setting. It's much longer term. It's community-based and dealt with multiple pathways. So we look at 12-step programs and the peer overlap. 12-step fellowships are prescriptive. They're abstinence-based. They're generally one pathway and one pathway only, and there's a program to follow. Peer support, it's non-prescriptive, it's multiple pathways, and it's self-directed. Now, none of that is to put down clinical. None of that is to put down 12-step programs, because both of those things are very important. So there are several types of peer support in Florida. So one of the first ones is a certified recovery peer specialist, CRPS. The second one is a certified recovery support specialist. And then we have a recovery coach designation. And there's also, I left one out of there, there's also a national peer that you can apply for as well. So a certified recovery peer specialist is defined as a person living in recovery from a mental health or substance use disorder. A CRPS is credentials designates competency in the domains of recovery support, advocacy, mentoring, and professional responsibilities. A CRPS applicants must attest to at least one of the lived experiences endorsements. So there are 4 endorsements: adult, youth, veteran, and family. A certified recovery peer specialist is defined as a person living in recovery from a mental health or substance use disorder, but a CRPS credential designates competency in the domains of recovery support, advocacy, and professional responsibility. Certified recovery peer specialists, applicants must attest to one of the lived experience endorsements: adult, a person holding a CRPS-A credential, attests to lived experience as an adult in recovery for a minimum of 2 years from a mental health and/or substance use disorder. A family is a person holding the CRPS-F credential, attests to lived experience as a family member or caregiver to another person who is living with a mental health and/or substance use disorder. Veteran designation is lived experience as a veteran of any branch of the armed forces who is in recovery for a minimum of 2 years from a mental health or substance use disorder. And then youth designation are between the ages of 18 to 29 at the time of application and have lived experience as a person who, between the ages of 14 to 25, experienced a significant life challenge and is now living a wellness and/or recovery-oriented lifestyle for at least 2 years. Certified recovery support specialists credential is for people who work side by side with clinical staff to provide recovery support services to individuals with substance use conditions. CRSS applicants may or may not have lived experience as a person in recovery. So they are not required to have lived experience with recovery. The CRSS designates competency in the domains of recovery management, practical living skills, and social development. There's resource linkage and follow-up, re-engagement, crisis support and safety, and professional responsibilities. Now, recovery coach is a strength-based support for persons in or seeking recovery from a substance use disorder and/or other addictions. Like a life or business coach, a recovery coach is a type of partnership where persons in or seeking recovery self-directs their recovery while the coach provides expertise in supporting successful change. This is out of Connecticut. And they have a statewide RCO there, and they created the recovery coach model. And there are many RCOs in the state of Florida that utilize the recovery coach model for recovery support. So where are recovery communities? Let me try this again. How were most RCOs in the Florida region developed? Well, about 5 years ago, the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association was awarded a 3.5-year grant by the Hanley Foundation to develop recovery community organizations throughout the state of Florida. At the time, there were 5 RCOs in Florida, 4 of which were in South Florida, and 1 was on the west coast of Florida. We didn't have any others. And so we adopted the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse's model of creating RCOs through a grassroots natural process. We started with community listening sessions. We had a recovery symposium where we featured and talked about multiple pathways. We brought in national speakers to talk about RCOs from a different perspective nationally. Then we began to do a visioning where we created the RCO in the community And then the natural leadership of the community. Remember, I told you earlier, people support what they build. That the cream rose to the top, and organizations were built. Out of that grant, we built 12 RCOs, with the 13th one being a state RCO. And if you look at the map of Florida, I included the managing entity region, and then I kind of compared it to this map is an interactive map on the statewide RCO, Floridians for Recovery .org. They have an RCO locator, so you can kind of go on there and look to see where an RCO is in your community. Also, any of the managing entities would be able to guide you to an RCO near you, if there is one. We got a lot of work still to do, and we're still doing that work. So I really like to talk about connections in Florida. I have included the website for the Florida Certification Board, which is how one would go about becoming a peer, a certified peer in the state of Florida. Also, I have included the website for Floridians for Recovery and the Florida Department of Children and Families for background screenings. So if you have a criminal background, you do have to go through an exemption process. Some of the laws have changed to make it a little easier to get that exemption, but you'd have to go through the process with the Florida Department of Children and Families. And then the national leader in RCO development and advocacy is Faces and Voices of Recovery, and I have included their website as well. They have a plethora of information on their website, toolkits, all that kind of stuff. They do national trainings. So if you're really interested, I would encourage you to contact them as well. Also under Faces and Voices of Recovery is the Association of Recovery Community Organizations, ARCO. And that is a membership, and there is a fee for that. But what you get out of that is you get support nationally, and they have monthly meetings, and it's really a very helpful association to be a part of. And then as an RCO grows, there is an accreditation for an RCO and recovery peer support services. And I would encourage anyone interested in that to go to their website. And then, I talked about recovery coach training, and I did include CCAR, Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery, their website, and they have information about where training is. They have some in Florida as well. And then SAMHSA, of course. I would encourage you to go to SAMHSA, and there's all kinds of publications to pull down and get information about. I want to thank you for the time you've spent with me. My contact information is here, and I can't open for questions because this is a recorded video. But if you do have questions or would like assistance with creating an RCO in your community, I would be happy to chat with you. Again, my name is Ginny LaRue. I identify as a woman in long-term recovery, and I am so grateful to the Hanley Foundation for asking me to do this webinar. Thank you.